Section 9. Missions and defeats. The period between the Crusades and the Reformation was one of gains and losses for Christendom. In Spain the Christian forces struggled with increasing success against the Mohammedans. Gradually, four Christian states dominated the peninsula. Castile conquered Toledo in 1085, defeated the Muslims at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, and united with Leon into a strong state in 1230. Little Navarre stretched on both sides of the Pyrenees. Meanwhile Aragon on the east and Portugal on the west were winning their independence, so that by 1250 Mohammedan power on the peninsula was confined to the Kingdom of Granada, whence it was to be driven in 1492. The Spanish Christian kingdoms were weak. The real power of Spain was not to be manifest till the joint reign of Ferdinand and Isabella united Castile and Aragon in 1479. In the east the Great Mongol Empire, which began with the conquest of northern China in 1213, stretched across northern Asia, conquering most of what is now European Russia between 1238 and 1241, and reaching the borders of Palestine in 1258. By this devastation the flourishing Nestorian Church in Central Asia, page 149, was almost annihilated. Yet after the first rush of conquest was over, Central Asia under Mongol control was accessible as it had never been before and was not to be till the 19th century. About 1262 Venetian merchants, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, made the long journey by land to Peking, where they were well received by the Mongol Khan, Kublai. Returning in 1269, they started again in 1271, taking Niccolo's more famous son, Marco, who entered the Khan's service. It was not till 1295 that the Polos were back in Venice. Even before their return an Italian Franciscan, John of Monte Cervino, had started in 1291 for Peking, where he established a church about 1300. Christianity flourished for a time. Pope Clement V, 1305–1314, appointed John an archbishop with 6 bishops under him. The work came to an end, however, when the Mongols and other foreigners were expelled from China by the victorious native Ming dynasty in 1368. Efforts were made to reach the Mohammedans, but with little success. Francis of Assisi himself preached to the Sultan in Egypt in 1219, page 258. More famous as a missionary was Raymond Lull, 1235–1315, a native of the island of Majorca. From a wholly worldly life he was converted in 1266, and now studied Arabic, as a missionary preparation, writing also his Ars Major, which he intended as an irrefutable demonstration of Christianity. In 1291 he began missionary work in Tunis, only to be expelled at the end of a year. He labored to induce the Pope to establish schools for missionary training. He went once more to Africa and was again driven out. His eloquence persuaded the Council of Vienne in 1311 to order teaching in Greek, Hebrew, Chaldee, and Arabic, in Avignon, Paris, Salamanca, Bologna, and Oxford, though this remained a pious wish. Back to Tunis he went as a missionary in 1314, and met a martyr's death by stoning the next year. He had little to show of missionary achievement, but much of missionary inspiration. The prevailing characteristic of this period was the loss of once Christian territories. The last of the conquests of the Crusaders in Palestine passed out of their hands in 1291. A new Mohammedan force was arising in the Ottoman Turks. Sprung from Central Asia, they attained an independent position in Asia Minor in 1300. In 1354 they invaded the European portion of the Eastern Empire, capturing Adrianople in 1361, and gradually spreading their rule over the Balkan lands. But a fragment of the empire remained till 1453, when Constantinople fell and the Eastern Empire was at an end. The victorious career of the Turks was to carry them, in the Reformation age, nearly half across Europe. Christians ruled by them were deprived of political rights, though Christian worship and organization continued, under conditions of much oppression. Thoroughly master of Germany than he. In spite of the Concordat of Worms he practically controlled the appointment of German bishops. On the other hand, his claims met with energetic resistance from the cities of northern Italy, which were growing strong on the commerce induced by the Crusades. This hostility he at first successfully overcame. With Alexander III, 1159 to 1181, Frederick's most able enemy mounted the papal throne. The cardinals were divided in the choice, and an imperialistic minority elected a rival pope, who called himself Victor IV, and whom Frederick and the German bishops promptly supported. Alexander's position was long difficult. In 1176, however, Frederick was defeated at Legnano by the Lombard League of Italian cities, and was forced to recognize Alexander. Frederick's attempt to control the papacy had been shattered, but his authority over the German bishops was scarcely diminished. Frederick won a further success over the papacy, in 1186, by the marriage of his son Henry with the heiress of Sicily and southern Italy, thus threatening the papal states from north and south. Alexander III also won at least an apparent success over Henry it, 1154 to 1189, one of the ablest of English kings. That monarch, in order to strengthen his hold over the English Church, secured the election of his apparently complacent chancellor, Thomas Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1162. Once in office, Becket showed himself a determined upholder of ecclesiastical clarence. Henry now, in 1164, secured the enactment of the Constitutions of Clarendon, limiting the right of appeal to Rome in ecclesiastical cases, restricting the power of excommunication, subjecting the clergy to civil courts, and putting the election of bishops under the control of the king, to whom they must do homage. Becket now openly broke with the king. In 1170 a truce was brought about, but it was of short duration, and a hasty expression of anger on the part of Henry led to Becket's murder just at the close of the year. Alexander used the deed skillfully. In 1172 Becket was canonized, and continued till the Reformation, one of the most popular of English saints. Henry was forced to abandon the Constitutions of Clarendon, and do penance at Becket's grave. Yet in spite of this apparent papal victory, Henry continued his control of English ecclesiastical affairs much as before. Frederick Barbarossa died in 1190, on the Third Crusade. He was succeeded by his son, Henry VI, 1190 to 1197, who, in 1194, obtained full possession of his wife's inheritance in Sicily and southern Italy, and developed ambitious plans of greatly extending his imperial sway. The papacy, with both ends of Italy in the possession of the German sovereign, was in great political danger, but the situation was relieved by the early death of Henry VI in 1197, and the accession to the papacy in 1198 of one of its ablest medieval representatives, Innocent III, 1198 to 1216. Innocent III was unquestionably a man of personal humility and piety, but no pope ever had higher conceptions of the papal office, and under him the papacy reached its highest actual power. The death of Henry VI saw Germany divided. One party supported the claims of Henry's brother, Philip of Swabia, the other those of Otto of Brunswick, of the rival house of Guelph. Out of this confused situation Innocent strove with great skill to bring advantage to the papacy. He secured large concessions in Italy and Germany from Otto, yet when Philip gradually gained the upper hand, Innocent secured an agreement that the rival claims should be submitted to the judgment of a court controlled by the Pope. The murder of Philip in 1208 frustrated this plan, and put Otto IV once more to the fore. Innocent now obtained from Otto the desired guarantee of the extent of the Papal States, and a promise to abandon control of German episcopal elections, and on the strength of these concessions crowned Otto emperor in 1209. Otto promptly forego kingdom as a fief from the Pope. Innocent's greatest apparent victory was, however, in the case of England. The cruel and unpopular King John, 1199 to 1216, in a divided election tried to secure his candidate as Archbishop of Canterbury. The dispute was appealed to Rome. The king's choice was set aside and Innocent's friend, Stephen Langton, received the prize. John resisted. Innocent laid England under ar interdict. The king drove out his clerical opponents. The Pope now excommunicated him, declared his throne forfeited and proclaimed a crusade against him. The defeated king not merely made a humiliating submission to the Pope, in 1213, but acknowledged his kingdom a fief of the papacy, agreeing to pay a feudal tax to the Pope of 1,000 marks annually. Yet when the barons and clergy wrung Magna Carta from John in 1215, Innocent denounced it as an injury to his vassal. In the internal affairs of the Church, Innocent's policy was strongly centralizing. He claimed for the papacy the right of decision in all disputed episcopal elections. He asserted sole authority to sanction the transfer of bishops from one see to another. His crusade against the Cathari has already been noted, page 253. The Great Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, at which transubstantiation was declared an article of faith, and annual confession and communion required, was also a papal triumph. The conquest of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, page 243, though not approved by Innocent, seemed to promise the subjection of the Greek Church to papal authority. In Innocent III the papacy reached the summit of its worldly power. The succeeding popes continued the same struggle, but with decreasing success. The Emperor Frederick II, ruler of Germany, as well as of northern and southern Italy and Sicily, a man of much political ability and of anything but medieval piety, though put in office largely by Innocent III, soon proved the chief opponent of the world pretensions of the papacy. Under Gregory LX, 1227–1241, the organizer of the Inquisition and the patron of the Franciscans, pages 254, 258, and Innocent IV, 1248–1254, the papal contest was carried on against Frederick II, with the utmost bitterness and with very worldly weapons. Frederick was excommunicated, and rivals were raised up against him in Germany by papal influence. The papacy seemed convinced that only the destruction of the Hohenstaufen line, to which Frederick belonged, would assure its victory. On Frederick's death in 1250 it pursued his son, Conrad IV, 1250–1254, with the same hostility, and gave his heritage in southern Italy and Sicily to Edmund of England, son of King Henry III. A new influence, that of France, was making itself felt in papal councils. Urban IV, 1261–1264, was a Frenchman and appointed French cardinals. He now gave, in 1263, southern Italy and Sicily to Charles of Anjou, brother of King Louis IX of France, 1226–1270. This was a turning point in papal politics, and with it the dependence of the papacy on France really began. The next pope was also a Frenchman, Clement IV, 1265–1268. During his papacy Conradin, the young son of Conrad IV, asserted his hereditary claims to southern Italy and Sicily by force of arms. He was excommunicated by Clement IV and defeated by Charles of Anjou, by whose orders he was beheaded in Naples, in 1268. With him ended the line of Hohenstaufen, which the popes had so strenuously opposed, though there is no reason to think that the pope was responsible in any way for Conradin's execution. These long quarrels and the consequent confusion had irreently enfeebled the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Thenceforward, to the Reformation, it was far more a group of feeble states than an effective single sovereignty. It was able to offer little resistance to papal demands. Other forces were, however, arising that would inevitably make impossible such a world sovereignty as Innocent II had exercised. One such force was the new sense of na. Thoughtful and religious men that such worldly aims as the recent papacy had followed were inconsistent with the true interests of the Church. These were growing forces with which the papacy must reckon. The weakness of the papacy, from a worldly point of view, was that it had no adequate physical forces at its disposal. It must balance off one competitor against another, and the wreck wrought in Germany left the door open to France without forces which could be matched against her. Papal interference in Germany continued. Pope Gregory X, 1271–1276, ordered the German electors, in 1273, to choose a king, under threat that the Pope himself would make the appointment if they failed. They chose Rudolf I, of Habsburg, 1273–1291, who promptly renewed the concessions to the papacy which had been once made by Otto IV and Frederick II. Quite otherwise was it speedily with France. The power of that monarchy had been rapidly growing, and in Philip IV, the Fair, 1285–1314, France had a king of absolute unscrupulousness, obstinacy, and high conceptions of royal authority. In Boniface VIII, 1294–1303, the papacy was held by a man of as lofty aspirations to world rule as had ever there been represented. Neither participant in the struggle commands much sympathy. War had arisen between France, Scotland, and England, which compelled the English king, Edward I, 1272–1307, to rally the support of all his subjects by inviting the representatives of the Commons to take a place in Parliament, in 1295, thus giving them a permanent share in the English national councils. The struggle also induced the kings of France and England to tax their clergy to meet its expenses. The clergy complained to Pope Boniface, who, in 1296 issued the bull Clerix Laicos, inflicting excommunication on all who demanded or paid such taxes on clerical property without papal permission. Philip replied by prohibiting the export of money from France, thus striking at the revenues of the Pope and of the Italian bankers. The latter moved Boniface to modify his attitude so that the clergy could make voluntary contributions, and even allowed that, in great necessities, the king could lay a tax. It was a royal victory. Comparative peace prevailed between Philip and Boniface for a few years. In 1301 the struggle again began. Philip had Bernard Cessay, Bishop of Pamiers, whom the Pope had recently sent to him as nuntius, arrested and charged with high treason. The Pope ordered Bernard's release and cited the French bishops, and ultimately King Philip himself, to Rome. In reply, Philip summoned the first French States General, in which clergy, nobles, and commoners were represented. This body, in 1302, sustained the king in his attitude of resistance. The Pope answered with the famous bull, Unam Sanctum. The high water mark of papal claim to supremacy over civil powers. It affirmed that temporal powers are subject to the spiritual authority, which is judged in the person of the Pope by God alone. It declared, following the opinion of Aquinas, page 277, that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human being to be subject to the Roman Pontiff, an affirmation the exact scope of which has led to much subsequent discussion. Philip answered with a new assembly, where the Pope was charged with an absurd series of crimes, involving heresy and moral depravity. An appeal was issued for a general council of the Church before which the Pope might be tried. Philip was determined that this should be no mere threat. He would force the Pope to consent. He therefore sent his able jurist vice-chancellor, William Nogaret, who joined to himself Boniface's ancient family enemy, Sciarra Colonna. Together they gathered a force and made Boniface a prisoner in Anagni, just as he was about to proclaim Philip's excommunication, in 1303. Boniface was courageous. He would make no concessions. His friends soon freed him, but a month later he died. These events were a staggering blow to please the king. An evidence of French domination that was patent to all the world was the removal of the seat of the papacy, in 1309, to Avignon on the river Rhone, a town not belonging indeed to the French kingdom, but in popular estimate amounting to the establishment of the papacy in France. Undoubtedly the troubled state of Italian politics had something to do with this removal. At Avignon the papacy was to have its seat till 1377, a period so nearly equal to the traditional exile of the Jews as to earn the name of the Babylonish captivity. Nor was the cup of Clement's humiliation yet filled. The cold-blooded king compelled him to join in the cruel destruction of the Templars, page 242. Clement V's pontificate is interesting as marking the conclusion, to the present, of the official collections of church or canon law. That great body of authority was the product of the history of the Church since the early councils, and embraced their decisions, the decrees of synods and of popes. The Middle Ages had seen many collections, of which the most famous was that gathered, probably in 1148, by Gratian, a teacher of canon law in Bologna. Pope Gregory IX, 1227–1241, caused an official collection to be formed, in 1234, including new decrees up to his time. Pope Boniface VIII, 1294–1303, published a similar edition in 1298, and Clement V, 1305–1314, enlarged it in 1314, though his work was not published till 1317, under his successor, John XX, 1316–1334. The great structure, thus laboriously erected through the centuries, is a mass of ecclesiastical jurisprudence embracing all domains of ecclesiastical life. Though official collections ceased from Clement V to the 20th century, the creation of church law has continued in all ages, and the recent Pope, Pius X, 1903–1914, in 1904 ordered the codification and simplification of the whole body of canon law by a special commission. Section 11. The Papacy in Avignon, Criticism. The schism. The popes, while the papacy was in Avignon, were all Frenchmen. It seemed as if the papacy had become a French institution. This association caused greatly increased restlessness in view of papal claims, especially in nations which, like England, were at war with France during much of this period, or Germany, on which the still continuing interference of the papacy bore hard. The ablest of the Avignon popes was unquestionably John XXA, 1316–1334. The double imperial election in Germany, in 1314, had divided that land between supporters of Louis the Bavarian, 1314–1347, and Frederick of Austria. John XXI, supported by King Philip V of France, 1316–1322, thought the occasion ripe to diminish German influence in Italy for the benefit of the states of the Church. He declined to recognize either claimant, and declared that the Pope had right to administer the empire during vacancies. When Louis interfered in Italian affairs, the Pope excommunicated him, and a contest with the papacy ensued which lasted till Louis's death. In its course the German electors issued the famous Declaration of 1338, in Reims, which was confirmed by the Reichstag in Frankfurt the same year, that the chosen head of the empire needs no approval from the papacy whatever for full entrance on or continuation in the duties of his office. These attacks upon the state aroused literary defenders of considerable significance. One of these was the great Italian poet, Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321. His Latin treatise, On Monarchy, is not surely dated, but was composed between 1311 and 1318. Dante holds that peace is the best condition of mankind. It is most effectively secured by an emperor. The power of empire rightfully came to Rome. It is as necessary for man's temporal happiness as the papacy is to guide men to eternal blessedness. Each is directly from God, and neither should interfere in the province of the other. Dante carefully controverts the papal interpretation of the Bible texts and historical instances on which Emperor Louis the Bavarian. Its radical views caused its authors to seek protection from the emperor, which they enjoyed, though with some hesitation, for the rest of their lives. They were excommunicated by John XXII in 1327, and Pope Clement VI declared, in 1343, that he had never read a worse heretical book. According to Marsilius, who was deeply versed in Aristotle, the basis of all power is the people, in the state the whole body of citizens, in the Church the whole body of Christian believers. They are the legislative power, by them rulers in Church and state are appointed, and to them these executive officers are responsible. The only final authority in the Church is the New Testament, but priests have no power of physical force to compel men to obey it. Their sole duty is to teach, warn, and reprove. The New Testament teaches that bishops and priests are equivalent designations, yet it is well, as a purely human constitution, to appoint some clergy superintendents over others. This appointment gives no superior spiritual power, nor has one bishop spiritual authority over another, or the Pope over all. Peter had no higher rank than the other apostles. There is no New Testament evidence that he was ever in Rome. The New Testament gives no countenance to the possession of earthly lordships and estates by clergymen. No bishop or pope has authority to define Christian truth as contained in the New Testament, or make binding laws. These acts can be done only by the legislative body of the Church, the whole company of Christian believers, represented in a general council. Such a council is the supreme authority in the Church. Since the Christian state and the Christian Church are coterminous, the executive of the Christian state, as representing a body of believers, may call councils, appoint bishops, and control church property. Here were ideas that were to bear fruit in the Reformation, and even in the French Revolution, but they were too radical greatly to impress their age. Their time was later, and something was lacking in Marsilius himself. He was a cool thinker rather than a man who could translate theory into action in such fashion as to create large leadership. Because of a zeal which Marsilius lacked, and of ideas not too much in advance of the age, a greater authority was wielded by William of Ockham, whose theological influence and energetic defense of the extremer Franciscan doctrine of the absolute poverty of Christ and the Apostles has been noted, Andy, pages 261, 278. Ockham, like Marsilius, found a refuge with Louis the Bavarian. To him, as to Dante, papacy and empire are both founded by God, and neither is superior to the other. Each has its own sphere. The Church has purely religious functions. Its final authority is the New Testament. Voices were raised in defense of papal claims. One of the most celebrated, though typical rather than original, was that of the Italian Augustinian monk, Augustinus Triumphus, 12431328. In his Summa de Potestate Ecclesiastica, written about 1322, he holds that all princes rule as subject to the Pope, who can remove them at pleasure. No civil law is binding if disapproved by him. The Pope can be judged by none, nor can one even appeal from the Pope to God, since the decision and court of God and the Pope are one. Yet should the Pope fall into heresy, his office is forfeited. These opinions of the papal supporters were far from being shared by Germans engaged in a struggle against the papacy for the political autonomy of the empire, or by Englishmen at war with France, who believed the Avignon papacy the tool of the French sovereign. Pope Clement V, 1305–1314, had asserted the right of the papacy to appoint to all ecclesiastical office. Such appointees were called provisors, and the intrusion of papal favorites in England aroused king and parliament in 1351 to enact the Statute of Provisors. Elections to bishoprics and other ecclesiastical posts should be free from papal money payments. Money taxes, rather than receipts in kind, were everywhere increasing. It was natural that this change should take place in church administration also, but the extent to which taxation was pushed by the popes of the 13th and 14th centuries was a scandal, and it was much aggravated when the removal of the papacy to Avignon largely cut off the revenues from the papal estates in Italy without diminishing the luxury or expensiveness of the papal court. This period saw the extensive development, in imitation of secular feudal practice, of the annates, that is a tax of 1 year's income, more or less, from each new appointment. Since the reservation of posts to exclusive papal appointment was at the same time immensely extended, this became a large source of revenue. The income of vacant benefices, also, became a significant source of papal receipts. Taxes for bulls and other papal documents, also rose rapidly in amount and productivity. These were but a portion of the papal exactions, and the total effect was the impression that the papal administration was heavily and increasingly burdensome on the clergy, and through them on the people. This feeling was augmented by the ruthless manner in which churchly censures, such as excommunication, were imposed on delinquent taxpayers. The papacy seemed extravagant in expenditure and offensive in taxation, and its repute in both respects was to grow worse till the Reformation. The collapse of the imperial power in Italy, for which the papacy was largely responsible, and the transfer to Avignon, left Italy to the wildest political confusion. Nowhere was the situation worse than in Rome. In 1347 Cola di Rienzi headed a popular revolution against the nobles and established a parody of the ancient republic. He was soon driven out, but in 1354 was in power again, only to be murdered in the partisan struggles. Innocent VI, 1352–1362, sent the Spanish Cardinal Albornoz, 1367, as his legate to Italy. By Albornoz's military and diplomatic abilities the papal interests in Rome and Italy generally were much improved, so that Urban V, 1362–1370, actually returned to the Eternal City in 1367. The death of Albornoz deprived him of his chief support, and in 1370 the papacy was once more in Avignon. Urban V was succeeded by Gregory XI, 1370–1378, whom Saint Catherine of Siena, 1347–1380, urged in the name of God to return to Rome. The distracted state of the city also counseled his presence if papal interests were to be preserved. Accordingly he transferred the papacy to Rome in 1377, and there died the next year. The sudden death of Gregory XI found the cardinals in Rome. A majority were French, and would gladly have returned to Avignon. The Roman people were determined to keep the papacy in Rome, and to that end to have an Italian pope. Under conditions of tumult the cardinals chose Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI, 1378–1389. A tactless man, who desired to terminate French influence over the papacy, and effect some reforms in the papal court, he soon had the hostility of all the cardinals. They now got together, 4 months after his election, declared their choice void since dictated by mob violence, and elected Cardinal Robert of Geneva as Pope Clement VII, 1378–1394. A few months later Clement VII and his cardinals were settled in Avignon. There had been many rival popes before, but they had been chosen by different elements. Here were 2 popes, each duly elected by the same body of cardinals. The objection that Urban VI had been chosen out of fear had little force, since the cardinals had recognized him without protest for several months, but they had done all they could to undo the choice. Europe saw 2 popes, each condemning the other. There was no power that could decide between them, and the several countries followed the one or the other as their political affinities dictated. The Roman Pope was acknowledged by Northern also working in the island. Of these that of Thomas Bradwardine, 1349, was one of the most potent in the intellectual realm. Bradwardine, who was long an eminent theologian in Oxford, and died Archbishop of Canterbury, was a leader in the revival of the study of Augustine, which marked the decline of scholasticism, and was to grow in influence till it profoundly affected the Reformation. He taught predestination in most positive form. Like Augustine, he conceived religion as primarily a personal relationship of God and the soul, and emphasized grace in contrast to merit. There were now, therefore, other intellectual traditions besides those of later nominalistic scholasticism in the Oxford of Wycliffe's student days. John Wycliffe, 1384, was born in Hipswell in Yorkshire. Few details of his early life are known. He entered Balliol College, Oxford, of which he became ultimately for a short time master. In Oxford he rose to great scholarly distinction, lecturing to large classes, and esteemed the ablest theologian of its faculty. Philosophically he was a realist, in contrast to the prevailing nominalism of his age. He was deeply influenced by Augustine, and through Augustine by Platonic conceptions. Wycliffe gradually became known outside of Oxford. In 1374 he was presented, by royal appointment, to the rectory of Lutterworth, and the same year was one of the king's commissioners, probably theological advisor, to attempt in Bruges with the representatives of Pope Gregory XI an adjustment of the dispute regarding provisors, ante, page 295. In how far these appointments were due to the powerful son of King Edward II, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, is uncertain, though he probably regarded Wycliffe as likely to be useful in his designs on church property, but Wycliffe's opinions, if entertained in 1374, cannot then have been widely known. There is no evidence that the Pope yet looked on him with distrust, and recent investigation has shown that his reformatory work did not begin in 1366, as formerly supposed. By 1376, however, it was the wealth of the Church and clerical interference, especially that of the popes, in political life, that aroused his opposition. He lectured that year in Oxford on civil lordship. Wycliffe's view of ecclesiastical office and privilege was curiously feudal. God is the great overlord. He gives all positions, civil and spiritual, as fiefs, to be held on condition of faithful service. They are lordships, not property. God gives the use but not the ownership. If the user abuses his trust he forfeits his tenure. Hence a bad ecclesiastic loses all claim to office, and the temporal possessions of unworthy clergy may well be taken from them by the civil rulers, to whom God has given the lordship of temporal things, as he has that of things spiritual to the Church. This doctrine, advanced in all simplicity and sincerity, was undoubtedly pleasing to John of Gaunt and his hungry crew of nobles who hoped for enrichment from church spoliation. It was no less satisfactory to many commoners, who had long been critical of the wealth, pretensions, and too often lack of character of the clergy. It was not displeasing to the mendicant orders, who had always, in theory at least, advocated apostolic poverty. Wycliffe's teaching aroused the opposition of the high clergy, the property-holding orders, and of the papacy. In 1377 he was summoned to answer before the Bishop of London, William Courtenay. The protection of John of Gaunt and other nobles rendered the proceeding abortive. The same year Pope Gregory XI issued 5 bulls ordering Wycliffe's arrest and examination, yet Wycliffe enjoyed the protection of a strong party at court and much popular favour, so that further proceedings against him by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London were frustrated in 1378. Wycliffe was now rapidly developing his reformatory activities, now flood of treatises in Latin and English. The Scriptures, he taught, are the only law of the. Convinced that the Bible is the law of God, Wycliffe determined to give it to the people in the English tongue. Between 1382 and 1384 the Scriptures were translated from the Vulgate. What share Wycliffe had in the actual work is impossible to say. It has been usually thought that the New Testament was from his pen, and the Old from that of Nicholas of Hereford. At all events, the New Testament translation was vivid, readable, and forceful, and did a service of fundamental importance for the English language, to say nothing of English piety. The whole was revised about 1388, possibly by Wycliffe's disciple, John Purvey. Its circulation was large. In spite of severe repression in the next century, at least 150 manuscripts survive. To bring the gospel to the people, Wycliffe began sending out his poor priests. In apostolic poverty, barefoot, clad in long robes, and with staff in the hand, they wandered 2 by 2, as had the early Waldensian or Franciscan preachers. Unlike the latter, they were bound by no permanent vows. Their success was great. But events soon lamed the Lollard movement, as the following of Wycliffe was popularly called. Convinced that the elect are a true priesthood, and that all episcopal claims are unscriptural, Wycliffe saw in the priestly power of exclusive human agency in the miracle of transubstantiation a main buttress of what he deemed erroneous priestly claim. He therefore attacked this doctrine in 1381. His own view of Christ's presence seems to have been essentially that later known as consubstantiation. It was not his positive assertions, but his attack, however, that aroused resentment, for to oppose transubstantiation was to touch one of the most popularly cherished beliefs of the later Middle Ages. That attack cost Wycliffe many followers and roused the churchly authorities to renewed action. This tide of opposition was strengthened by events in 1881, for which Wycliffe was in no way responsible. The unrest of the lower orders, which had been growing since the dislocation of the labor market by the Black Death of 1348 to 1350, culminated in 1381 in a great peasant revolt, which was with difficulty put down. This bloody episode strengthened the party of conservatism. In 1382 the Archbishop of Canterbury held a synod in London by which 24 Wycliffite opinions were condemned. Wycliffe was no longer able to lecture in Oxford. His poor priests were arrested. He was too strong in popular and courtly support, however, to be attacked personally, and he died still possessed of his pastorate in Lutterworth on the last day of 1384. No small element in Wycliffe's power was that he was thought to have no scholastic equal in contemporary England. Men hesitated to cross intellectual swords with him. Equally conspicuous were his intense patriotism and his deep piety. He voiced the popular resentment of foreign papal taxation and greed, and the popular longing for a simpler, more biblical faith. It was his misfortune that he left no follower of conspicuous ability to carry on his work in England. Yet throughout the reign of Richard II, 1377 to 1399, the Lollard movement continued to grow. With the accession of the usurping House of Lancaster in the person of Henry IV, 1399 to 1413, the king, anxious to placate the Church, was persuaded to secure the passage in 1401 of the Statute de Heretico Comburendo, under which a number of Lollards were burned. Henry IV spared Lollards in high lay station. Not so his son, Henry V, 1413 to 1422. Under him their most conspicuous leader, Sir J. Owen Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, a man of the sternest religious principles, whom tradition and dramatic license transformed into the figure of Falstaff, was condemned, driven into rebellion, and executed SN 1417. With his death the political significance of Lollardy in England was at an end, though adherents continued in secret till the Reformation. Wycliffe's chief influence was to be in Bohemia rather than in the land of his birth. Bohemia. A more frequent participation in the Lord's Supper. Millix and Matthias taught that Antichrist was at hand, and was manifest in an unworthy clergy. These men had little direct influence on Huss, but they stirred Bohemia to a readiness to accept his teachings. Bohemia was torn, furthermore, by intense rivalry between the Germanic and the Slavonic, Czech, elements of the population. The latter was marked by a strong desire for racial supremacy and Bohemian autonomy. Curiously, also, Bohemia, hitherto so little associated with England, was brought into connection with that country by the marriage of the Bohemian princess, Anna, to King Richard II, in 1883. Bohemian students were attracted to Oxford, and thence brought Wycliffe's doctrines and writings into their native land, especially to the University of Prague. The great propagator of Bohemian Wycliffism was to be John Huss, in whom, also, all Czech national aspirations were to have an ardent advocate. It was this combination of religious and patriotic zeal that gave Huss his remarkable power of leadership. John Huss was born, of peasant parentage, in Husinec, whence he derived his name by abbreviation, about the year 1373. His studies were completed in the University of Prague, where he became Bachelor of Theology in 1394, and Master of Arts 2 years later. In 1401 he was ordained to the priesthood, still maintaining a teaching connection with the university, of which he was rector in 1402. Meanwhile Huss had become intimately acquainted with Wycliffe's philosophical treatises, with the realism of which he sympathized. Wycliffe's religious works, known by Huss certainly from 1402, won his approbation, and henceforth Huss was, theologically, a disciple of Wycliffe. More conservative than his master, he did not deny transubstantiation, but like him he held the Church to consist of the predestinate only, of whom the true head is not the Pope, but Christ, and of which the law is the New Testament, and its life that of Christ-like poverty. Though the publication of Huss's commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard has led to a higher estimate of his scholarly gifts than formerly prevailed, it is certain that in his sermons and treatises Huss usually reproduced not only the thoughts but the language of Wycliffe. In 1402 Huss became preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel, in Prague, and soon gained immense popular following through his fiery sermons in the Bohemian language. Though Wycliffite views were condemned by the majority of the university in 1403, Huss's preaching had, at first, the support of the Archbishop, Zbyněk, 1403–1411, but his criticisms of the clergy gradually turned this favor into opposition, which was increased as Huss's essential agreement with Wycliffe constantly became more evident. New causes of dissent speedily arose. In the schism Bohemia had held to the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, 1406–1415. As a step toward the healing of the breach, King Wenzel of Bohemia now favored a policy of neutrality between the rival popes. Huss and the Bohemian element in the university supported Wenzel. Archbishop Zbyněk, the German clergy, and the German portion of the university clung to Gregory XII. Wenzel therefore, in 1409, arbitrarily changed the constitution of the university, giving the foreign majority 1 vote in its decisions and the Bohemians 3, thus completely reversing the previous proportion. The immediate result was the secession of the foreign elements and the foundation, in 1409, of the University of Leipzig. This Bohemian nationalist victory, of doubtful permanent worth or right, Huss fully shared. Its immediate consequences were that he became the first rector of the newly regulated university, and enjoyed a high degree of courtly favor. His views were now spreading widely in Bohemia. Meanwhile the luckless Council of Pisa had run its course, 1409, see page 307. Zbyněk now supported its pope, Alexander V, 1409–1410, to whom he complained of the spread of Wycliffe. Prague. To this period of retirement is due the composition of his chief work, essentially a reproduction of Wycliffe, the De Ecclesia, on the Church. In 1413 a synod in Rome formally condemned Wycliffe's writings. The Great Council of Constance, see page 308, was approaching, and the confusion in Bohemia was certain to demand its consideration. Huss was asked to present himself before it, and promised a safe conduct, afterward received, by the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund. Huss, though he felt his life in grave peril, determined to go, partly believing it his duty to bear witness to what he deemed the truth, and partly convinced that he could bring the council to his way of thinking. Shortly after his arrival in Constance he was imprisoned. Sigismund disregarded his promised safe conduct. His Bohemian enemies laid bitter charges against him. On May 4, 1415, the council condemned Wycliffe, and ordered his long-buried body burned. Huss could hope for no favorable hearing. Yet, in the end, the struggle resolved itself into a contest of principles. The council maintained that every Christian was bound to submit to its decisions. Only by so holding could it hope to end the papal schism which was the scandal of Christendom. It insisted on Huss's complete submission. The Bohemian reformer was of heroic mold. He would play no tricks with his conscience. Some of the accusations he declared false charges. Other positions he could not modify unless convinced of their error. He would not submit his conscience to the overruling judgment of the council. On July 6, 1415, he was condemned and burned, meeting his death with the most steadfast courage. While Huss was a prisoner in Constance, his followers in Prague began administering the cup to the laity in the Lord's Supper, an action which Huss approved and which soon became the badge of the Hussite movement. The news of Huss's death aroused the utmost resentment in Bohemia, to which fuel was added when the Council of Constance forbade the use of the cup by laymen, and caused Huss's disciple, Jerome of Prague, to be burned in 1416. Bohemia was in revolution. Two parties speedily developed therein: aristocratic, having its principal seat in Prague, and known as the Utraquists, communion in both bread and wine, and a radical, democratic, called from its fortress, the Taborites. The Utraquists would forbid only those practices which they deemed prohibited by the law of God. 7. Cent. The Bible. They demanded free preaching of the gospel, the cup for the laity, apostolic poverty, and strict clerical life. The Taborites repudiated all practices for which express warrant could not be found in the law of God. Fierce quarrel existed between these factions, but both united to resist repeated crusades directed against Bohemia. Under the leadership of the blind Taborite general, John Ziska, all attempts to crush the Hussites were bloodily defeated. Church property was largely confiscated. Nor were the opponents of the Hussites more successful after Ziska's death in 1424. Under Prokop the Great, the Hussites carried the war beyond the borders of Bohemia. Some compromise seemed unavoidable. The Council of Basel, see page 310, after long negotiation, therefore, met the wishes of the Utraquists part way in 1433, granting the use of the cup, and in a measure the other demands outlined above. The Taborites resisted and were almost swept away by the Utraquists, in 1434, at the Battle of Lipan, in which Prokop was killed. The triumphant Utraquists now came to an agreement with the Council of Basel, in 1436, and on these terms were nominally given place in the Roman Communion. Yet, in 1462 Pope Pius II, 1458–1464, declared this agreement void. The Utraquists, nevertheless, held their own, and the Bohemian Parliament, in 1485 and 1512, declared their full equality with the Catholics. At the Reformation a considerable portion welcomed the newer ideas, others then returned to the Roman Church. The real representative. 9. Their thought of the Church was a one-sided development of Augustinianism. Their conception of the relation of the clergy to property is that common to the Waldenses and the founders of the great mendicant orders. Their religious earnestness commands deep admiration, but in spite of Luther's recognition of many points of agreement with Huss, the Reformation owed little to their efforts. Section 13. The reforming councils. The papal schism was the scandal of Christendom, but its termination was not easy. The logic of medieval development was that no power exists on earth to which the papacy is answerable. Yet good men everywhere felt that the schism must be ended, and that the Church must be reformed, in head and members, that is, in the papacy and clergy. The reforms desired were moral and administrative. Doctrinal modifications were as yet unwished by Christendom as a whole. A Wycliffe might proclaim them in England, but he was generally esteemed a heretic. Foremost among those who set themselves seriously to the task of healing the schism were the teachers of the age, especially those of the University of Paris. Marsilius of Padua had there proclaimed the supremacy of a general council in his Defensor Pacis of 1324. The necessities of the situation rather than his arguments were rapidly leading to the same conclusion. It was presented first with clearness by a doctor of canon law, then in Paris, Conrad of Gelnhausen, 1320-1390, who advised King Charles V of France, 13864-1380, in written treatises of 1379 and 1380, to unite with other princes in calling a council, if necessary, without the consent of the rival popes. Conrad went no further than to hold that such a council was justified by the necessities of an anomalous situation. Conrad's proposal was reinforced, in such fashion as to rob him of the popular credit of its origination, by the treatise of another German scholar at the University of Paris, Heinrich of Langenstein, 1340-1397, set forth in 1381. The thought of a general council as the best means of healing the schism, thus launched, made speedy converts, not only in the University of Paris, but in the great school of canon law in Bologna, and even among the cardinals. To call a council presented many difficulties, however, and the leaders at Paris, Peter of Ailly, Pierre d'Ailly, 1350-1420, and John Gerson, Jean Charlier de Gerson, 1363-1429, famed for their mastery of nominalistic theology, and the latter eminent among Christian mystics, were slow to adopt the conciliar plan. Efforts were vainly made for years to induce the rival popes to resign. France withdrew from the Avignon Pope, without recognizing the Roman, from 1398 to 1403, and again in 1408, but its example found slight following elsewhere. By 1408 d'Ailly and Gerson had come to see in a council the only hope, and were supported by Nicholas of Clemanges, 1367 to 1437, a former teacher of the Parisian University who had been papal secretary in Avignon from 1397 to 1405, to whom one great source of evil in the Church seemed the general neglect of the Scriptures. The cardinals of both popes were now convinced of the necessity of a council. Meeting together in Leghorn, in 1408, they now issued a call in their own names for such an assembly in Pisa, to gather on March 25, 1409. There it met with an attendance not only of cardinals, bishops, the heads of the great orders, and leading abbots, but also of doctors of theology and canon law, and the representatives of lay sovereigns. Neither pope was present or acknowledged its rightfulness. Both were declared deposed. This was a practical assertion that the council was superior to the papacy. Its action, however, was too hasty, for instead of ascertaining, as d'Ailly advised, whether the person of the proposed new pope would be generally acceptable, the cardinals now elected Peter Falarges, Archbishop of Milan, who took the name Alexander V, 1409 to 1410. The council then dissolved, leaving the Case convinced of the necessity of a council. He recognized as Pope John X 1410 to 1415, one of the least worthy of occupants of that office, who had been chosen successor to Alexander V in the Pisan line. Sigismund used John's difficulties with King Ladislaus of Naples, to secure from him joint action by which Emperor-elect and Pope called a council to meet in Constance on November 1, 1414. There the most brilliant and largely attended gathering of the Middle Ages assembled. As in Pisa, it included not only cardinals and bishops, but doctors of theology and representatives of monarchs, though the lay delegates were without votes. Sigismund was present in person, and also John XXII. John XXII hoped to secure the endorsement of the council. To this end he had brought with him many Italian bishops. To neutralize their votes the council organized by nations, the English, German, and French, to which the Italians were forced to join as a fourth. Each nation had one vote, and *1 was assigned also to the cardinals. Despairing of the council's approval, John XXII attempted to disrupt its session by flight, in March, 1415. Under Gerson's vigorous leadership the council, however, declared on April 6, 1415, that as, representing the Catholic Church militant, it has its power immediately from Christ, and every one, whatever his position or rank, even if it be the papal dignity itself, is bound to obey it in all those things which pertain to the faith, to the healing of the schism, and to the general reformation of the Church of God. On May 29 the council declared John Exii deposed. On July 4 Gregory XII resigned. The council had rid the Church of two popes by its successful assertion of its supreme authority over all in the Church. It is easy to see why its leaders insisted on a full submission from Huss, whose trials and martyrdom were contemporary with these events. Ante, page 304. Benedict XIII proved more difficult. Sigismund himself, therefore, journeyed to Spain. Benedict he could not persuade to resign, and that obstinate pontiff asserted himself till death, in 1422 or 1423, as the only legitimate pope. What Sigismund was unable to effect with Benedict he accomplished with the Spanish kingdoms. They in Scotland repudiated Benedict. The Spaniards joined the council as a fifth nation, and, on July 26, 1417, Benedict, or Peter de Luna, as he was once more called, was formally deposed. The careful action of the council, in contrast to the haste in Pisa, had made it certain that no considerable section of Christendom would support the former popes. One main purpose of the council had been moral and administrative reform. Here the jealousies of the several interests prevented achievement of real importance. The cardinals desired no changes that would materially lessen their revenue. Italy, on the whole, profited by the existing situation. England had relative self-government already in ecclesiastical affairs, thanks to its kings. France was at war with England, and indisposed to unite with that land. So it went, with the result that the council finally referred the question of reforms to the next pope, in conjunction with this holy council or with the deputies of the several nations, that is, each nation was left to make the best bargain it could. The council enumerated a list of subjects for reform discussion, which relate almost entirely to questions of appointment, taxation, or administration too. As a reformatory instrument the Council of Constance was a bitter disappointment. Its one great achievement was that it ended the schism. In November, 1417, the cardinals, with 6 representatives from each nation, elected a Roman cardinal, Otto Colonna, as pope. He took the name Martin v. 1417 to 1431. Roman Christendom had once more a single head. In April, 1418, the council ended, the new pope promising to call another in 5 years, in compliance with the decree of the council. The Council of Constance was a most interesting. December Eugene ordered it adjourned, to meet in Bologna in 1433. The council refused, and re-enacted the Declaration of Constance that it was superior to the pope. Thus, almost from the first, bad feeling existed between the Council of Basel and the papacy. Mindful that jealousies between nations had frustrated the reform plans in Constance, the council rejected such groupings, and instead organized 4 large committees, on reform, doctrine, public peace, and general questions. It began its work with great vigor and promise of success. It made an apparent reconciliation with the moderate Hussites in 1433, ante, page 305. Roman unity seemed restored. The Pope found little support and, before the close of 1433, formally recognized the council. Its future seemed assured. The Council of Basel now proceeded to those administrative and moral reforms which had failed of achievement at Constance. It ordered the holding of a synod in each diocese annually, and in each archbishopric every 2 years, in which abuses should be examined and corrected. It provided for a general council every 10 years. It reasserted the ancient rights of canonical election against papal appointments. It limited appeals to Rome. It fixed the cardinals at 24 in number, and ordered that no nation should be represented by more than a third of the college. It cut off the annates and the other more oppressive papal taxes entirely. All this was good, but the spirit in which it was done was increasingly a vindictive attitude toward Pope Eugene. The taxes by which the papacy had heretofore been maintained were largely abolished, but no honorable support of the papacy was provided in their stead. This failure not only increased the anger of the papacy but caused division in the council itself. At this point a great opportunity presented itself, of which Eugene IV made full use, and regarding which the council so put itself in the wrong as to ruin its prospects. The Eastern Empire was now hard-pressed in its final struggles with the conquering Turks. In the hope of gaining help from the West, the Emperor, John VIII, 1425–1448, with the Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II, 1416–1439, and Bessarion, 1395–1472, the gifted Archbishop of Nika, were ready to enter into negotiation for the union of the Greek and Latin churches. Both Pope and Council were disposed to use this approach for their several advantage. The majority of the Council would have the Greeks come to Avignon. The Pope offered an Italian city, which the Greeks naturally preferred. The Council divided on the issue in 1437, the minority seceding, including Caesarini. The Pope now announced the transference of the Council to Ferrara to meet the Greeks. Thither the minority went, and there in March, 1438, the Eastern Emperor, with many Oriental prelates, arrived. The Pope had practically won. An event so full of promise as the reunion of Christendom robbed the still continuing Council of Basel of much of its interest. The Council of Ferrara, which was transferred to Florence in 1439, witnessed protracted discussion between Greeks and Latins, in which as a final result the primacy of the Pope was accepted in vague terms, which seemed to preserve the rights of the Eastern Patriarchs. The Greeks retained their peculiarities of worship and priestly marriage, while the disputed filioque clause of the Creed was acknowledged by the Greeks, though with the understanding that they would not add it to the ancient symbol. Mark, the vigorous Archbishop of Ephesus, refused agreement, but the emperor and most of his ecclesiastical following approved, and the reunion of the two churches was joyfully proclaimed in July, 1439. An event so happy greatly increased the prestige of Pope Eugene IV. The hollowness of the achievement was not at once apparent. Reunions with the Armenians, and with certain groups of Monophysites and Nestorians, were also announced in Florence or speedily after the council. The Reconcili. OK, the name Felix VY. By this time, however, the Council of Basel was fast losing its remaining influence. Eugene IV had won, and was succeeded in Rome by Nicholas V, 1447–1455. Felix V laid down his impossible papacy in 1449. The council put the best face on its defeat by choosing Nicholas V his successor, and ended its troubled career. Though the council idea still lived and was to be powerful in the Reformation age, the fiasco in Basel had really ruined the hope of transforming the papacy into a constitutional monarchy or of effecting needed reform through conciliar action. Yet if the council thus failed, individual nations profited by its quarrel with the papacy, notably France, where the monarchy was coming into new power through effective resistance to England under impulses initiated by Joan of Arc, 1410–1431. In 1438 King Charles VI, 1422–1461, with the clergy and nobles, adopted the pragmatic sanction of Bourges, by which the greater part of the reforms attempted in Basel were enacted into law for France. France therefore secured relief from the most pressing papal taxes and interferences, and this freedom had not a little to do with the attitude of the land previous to the Reformation age. Not so fortunate was Germany. There the nobles and the Reichstag in Mainz of 1439 adopted an acceptation much resembling the French pragmatic sanction, but the divisions and weakness of the country gave room to papal intrigue, so that its provisions were practically limited by the Concordat of Aschaffenburg of 1448. Certain privileges were granted to particular princes, but Germany, as a whole, remained under the weight of the papal taxation. Throughout the period of the councils a new force was manifesting itself, that of nationality. The Council of Constance had voted by nations. It had authorized the nations to make terms with the papacy. Bohemia had dealt with its religious situation as a nation. France had asserted its national rights. Germany had tried to do so. With the failure of the councils to effect administrative reform, men began asking whether what they had sought might not be secured by national action. It was a feeling that was to increase till the Reformation, and greatly to influence the course of that struggle. Section 14. The Italian Renaissance and its popes. The most remarkable intellectual event contemporary with the story of the papacy in Avignon and the schism was the beginning of the Renaissance. That great alteration in mental outlook has been treated too often as without medieval antecedents. It is coming to be recognized that the Middle Ages were not uncharacterized by individual initiative, that the control of the Church was never such as to make otherworldliness wholly dominant, and that the literary monuments of Latin antiquity, at least, were widely known. The revival of Roman law had begun contemporaneously with the Crusades, and had attracted increasing attention to that normative feature of ancient thought, first in Italy and later in France and Germany. Yet when all these elements are recognized, it remains true that the Renaissance involved an essentially new outlook on the world, in which emphasis was laid on its present life, beauty, and satisfaction, on man as man rather than on a future heaven and hell, and on man as an object of salvation or of loss. The means by which this transformation was wrought was a reappreciation of the spirit of classical antiquity, especially as manifested in its great literary monuments. The Renaissance first found place in Italy. Its rise was favored by many influences, among which three, at least, were conspicuous. The two great dominating powers of the Middle Ages, the papacy and empire, were suddenly lamed, as far as Italy was concerned, by the collapse of the imperial power in the latter part of the 13th century and the removal of the papacy to Avignon early in the 14th. The commerce of Italy, fostered by the Crusades and Continui. That worship of form rather than of substance which were to be characteristic of much of Italian humanism, but he aroused men to a new interest in antiquity and a new world outlook. Petrarch's friend and disciple was Boccaccio, 1313–1375, now chiefly remembered for his Decameron, but greatly influential in his own age in promoting the study of Greek, in unlocking the mysteries of classical mythology, and in furthering humanistic studies in Florence and Naples. Greek may never have died out in southern Italy, but its humanistic cultivation began when, in 1360, Boccaccio brought Leontius Pilatus to Florence. About 1397 Greek was taught, under the auspices of the government of the same city, by Manuel Chrysoloras, 1355–1415, who translated Homer and Plato. The Council of Ferrara and Florence, 1438–1489, ante, page 311, greatly fostered this desire to master the treasures of the East by bringing Greeks and Latins together. Bessarion, ante, page 312, thenceforth aided the work. To the influence of Gemistos Plethon, 1355–1450, another Greek attendant on this reunion council, was due the founding of the Platonic Academy, about 1442, by Cosimo de' Medici, 1389–1464, the real ruler of Florence. There the study of Plato was pursued ardently. Later, under the leadership of Marsilio Ficino, 1433–1499. Ficino, who became a priest, combined an earnest Christianity with his Platonic enthusiasm. He believed a return to the Christian sources the chief need of the time, a feeling not shared by the majority of Italian humanists, but to be profoundly influential beyond the Alps, as propagated by his admirers, Jacques Lefebvre in France and John Colet in England. Colet, in turn, transmitted it to Erasmus. Almost as influential was Pico della Mirandola, 1463–1494, whose zeal for Hebrew and knowledge of the Kabbalah were to influence Reuchlin. Historical criticism was developed by Lorenzo Valla, 1405–1457, who exposed the falsity of the donation of Constantine, ante, page 204, about 1440, and denied the composition of the Apostles' Creed by the Apostles. He criticized the rightfulness of monastic vows, and laid the foundation of New Testament studies, in 1444, by a comparison of the Vulgate with the Greek. An examination of the dates just given will show that the Renaissance movement in Italy was in full development before the fall of Constantinople, in 1453. By the middle of the 15th century it was dominating the educated class in Italy. In general, its attitude toward the Church was one of indifference. It revived widely a pagan point of view, and sought to reproduce the life of antiquity in its vices as well as its virtues. Few periods in the world's history have been so boastfully corrupt as that of the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance movement was given wings by a great invention, about 1440–1450, that of printing from movable type. Whether Mainz or Strasbourg, in Germany, or Haarlem in Holland was its birthplace is still a matter of learned dispute. The art spread with rapidity, and not only rendered the possession of the many the books which had heretofore been the property of the few, but, from the multiplication of copies, made the results of learning practically indestructible. More than 30,000 publications were issued before 1500. No mention of the Renaissance could fail to note its services to art. Beginnings of better things had been made, indeed, in Italy before its influence was felt. Cimabue, 1240–13027, Giotto, 1267–1337, and Fra Angelico, 1387–1455, belonged to the pre-Renaissance epoch, remarkable as is their work. With Masaccio, 1402–1429, Filippo Lippi, 1406–1469, Botticelli, 1444–1510, and Ghirlandaio, 1449–1494, painting advanced through truer knowledge of perspective, greater anatomical accuracy, and more effective grouping to the full noonday of a Leonardo da Vinci, 1452–1519, a Raphael Sanzio, 14831520, a Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475–1564, and their mighty associates. Sculpture received a Sim. Us it, 1458–1464, the papacy had a remarkable occupant. In early life a supporter of the conciliar movement, and active, at the Council of Basel, he had one distinction as a humanistic writer of decidedly unclerical tone. Reconciled to Eugene IV, he became a cardinal, and ultimately pope, now opposing all the conciliar views that he had once supported, and forbidding future appeals to a general council. His efforts to stir Europe against the Turks were unavailing. Yet, in spite of his changing and self-seeking attitude, he had the most worthy conception of the duties of the papal office of any pope of the latter half of the 15th century. The succeeding popes, till after the dawn of the Reformation, were patrons of letters and artists, great builders who adorned Rome and felt the full impulse of the Renaissance. Meanwhile a change had come over the ideals and ambitions of the papacy. The stay in Avignon and the schism had rendered effective control in the states of the Church impossible. They were distracted by the contests of the people of Rome, and especially by the rivalries of the noble houses, notably those of the Colonna and the Orsini. Italy had gradually consolidated into 5 large states, Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, or the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as it was called, and the states of the Church, though many smaller territories remained outside these larger groups, and were objects of contest. The politics of Italy became a kaleidoscopic effort to extend the possessions of the larger powers, and to match one against the other, in which intrigue, murder, and duplicity were employed to an almost unexampled extent. Into this game of Italian politics the papacy now fully plunged. Its desire was to consolidate and increase the states of the Church and maintain political independence. Its ambitions and its aims were like those of other Italian rulers. The papacy became secularized as at no other period in its history, save possibly the 10th century. Martin V, 1417–1431, the pope chosen at the Council of Constance, himself a Colonna, succeeded, in a measure, in restoring papal authority in Rome. His successor, Eugene IV, 1431–1447, was not so fortunate, and spent a large part of his pontificate in Florence. Nicholas V, 1447–1455, the humanist, effectively controlled Rome and strengthened the papal authority, a policy which was continued by Calixtus It, 1455–1458, Pius II, 1458–1464, and Paul II, 1464–1471. With Sixtus IV, 1471–1484, political ambition took almost complete control of the papacy. He warred with Florence, he sought to enrich and advance his relatives, he aimed to extend the states of the Church. A patron of learning, he built extensively. The Sistine Chapel preserves his name. All these endeavors required money, and he increased papal taxation and the financial abuses of the Curia. He made into an article of faith the widespread belief that indulgences are available for souls in purgatory by a bull of 1476. The next pope, Innocent VIII, 1484–1492, was of weak and pliant nature, notorious through the open manner in which he sought to advance the fortunes of his children, his extravagant expenditures, and his sale of offices. He even received a pension from Sultan Bayezid II for keeping the latter's brother and rival, Jem, a prisoner. Innocent's successor, Alexander VI, 1492–1503, a nephew of Calixtus III, and a Spaniard, Rodrigo Borja, obtained the papacy not without bribery, and was a man of unbridled immorality, though of considerable political insight. His great effort was to advance his bastard children, especially his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, by advantageous marriages, and his unscrupulous and murderous son, Cesare Borgia, by aiding him to carve a principality out of the states of the Church. His reign saw the beginning of the collapse of Italian independence through the invasion of Charles VIII of France, 1483–1498, in 1494, in an attempt to assert the French king's claim to th. importance. Julius II was undoubtedly a ruler of great talents, who led his soldiers personally, and was animated by a desire to strengthen the temporal power of the papacy, rather than to enrich his relatives. As a patron of art and a builder he was among the most eminent of the popes. Julius II was succeeded by Giovanni de' Medici, who took the name Leo X, 1513–1521. With all the artistic and literary tastes of the great Florentine family of which he was a member, he combined a love of display and extravagant expenditure. Far less warlike than Julius II, and free from the personal vices of some of his predecessors, he nevertheless made his prime interests the enlargement of the states of the Church, and the balancing of the various factions of Italy, domestic and foreign, for the political advantage of the papacy. He strove to advance his relatives. In 1516 he secured by a concordat with Francis I of France, 1515–1547, the abolition of the pragmatic sanction, ante, page 313, on terms which left to the king the nomination of all high French ecclesiastics and the right to tax the clergy, while the annates and other similar taxes went to the pope. The next year a revolt began in Germany, the gravity of which Leo never really comprehended, which was to tear half of Europe from the Roman obedience. Such popes represented the Italian Renaissance, but they in no sense embodied the real spirit of a church which was to millions the source of comfort in this life and of hope for that to come. A revolution was inevitable. Nor did such a papacy represent the real religious life of Italy. The Renaissance affected only the educated and the upper classes. The people responded to appeals of preachers and the example of those they believed to be saints, though unfortunately seldom with lasting results save on individual lives. Such a religious leader, when the Renaissance was young, was Saint Catherine, 1347–1380, the daughter of a dyer of Siena. A mystic, the recipient as she believed of divinely sent visions, she was a practical leader of affairs, a healer of family quarrels, a main cause in persuading the papacy to return from Avignon to Rome, a fearless denouncer of clerical evils, and an ambassador to whom popes and cities listened with respect. Her correspondence involved counsel of almost as much political as religious value to many of the leaders of the age in church and state alike. Even more famous in the later period of the Renaissance was Girolamo Savonarola of Florence, 1452–1498. A native of Ferrara, intended for the medical profession, a refusal of marriage turned his thoughts to a monastic life. In 1474 he became a Dominican in Bologna. 8 years later his work in Florence began. At first little successful as a preacher, he came to speak with immense popular effectiveness, that was heightened by the general conviction which he himself shared that he was a divinely inspired prophet. He was in no sense a Protestant. His religious outlook was thoroughly medieval. The French invasion of 1494 led to a popular revolution against the Medici, and Savonarola now became the real ruler of Florence, which he sought to transform into a penitential city. A semi-monastic life was adopted by many of the inhabitants. At the carnival seasons of 1496 and 1497, masks, indecent books and pictures were burned. For the time being the life of Florence was radically changed. But Savonarola aroused enemies. The adherents of the deposed Medici hated him, and above all, Pope Alexander VI, whose evil character and misrule Savonarola denounced. The Pope excommunicated him and demanded his punishment. Friends sustained him for a while, but the fickle populace turned against him. In April, 1498, he was arrested, cruelly tortured, and on May 23 hanged and his body burned by the city government. Not the least of Alexander VI's crimes was his persecution of this preacher of righteousness, though Savonarola's death was due quite as much to Florentine